I thought it would be fun for Halloween to compile a list of horror films that I'd like to recommend. But instead of doing a best of, which would be obvious and maybe a little dull, instead talk about some films that I think are terrific but I don't hear a lot about these days, either because time passed them by or maybe they were undercut by more popular films, or both. So this top 9 is by no means definitive, and I'm not using strict genre guidelines. I just think these films are worth checking out if you haven't seen them, and feel free to recommend me an underrated horror film in the comments that you'd think I'd enjoy. So, without further ado, the 1988 remake of the 1958 B-movie classic, Chuck Russell's The Blob manages to encapsulate a nostalgic small-town Americana setting, and then gleefully kill off just about all the primary characters with a black sense of humor that is as much a parody of 80s horror tropes as it is a solid horror film in its own right. This was one of Frank Darabont's first efforts as a screenwriter, and you can really see how he developed into the director who would do some of the best Stephen King adaptations to date. A word on schlock, Kevin Dillon is pretty terrible in this, but Shawnee Smith as the young heroine is excellent. Great cameo by Donovan Leitch as well. From 1985, written and directed by Dan O'Bannon, who had co-written Alien. At a time when zombie films had all but fallen off the radar, this film would look at a zombie outbreak from the point of view of some goofy punk rock kids and the equally goofy uptight managers at a medical supply warehouse who have accidentally released the toxin that reanimates the dead. Terrific deadpan comedy in this. Stuart Gordon did several modern adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft, and this one from 1985 is a personal favorite, about a machine that creates harmonic vibrations that allow people to see into a dimension just outside of their senses, where predictably a great evil lurks. If you like campy horror mixed with softcore porn, it doesn't get much better than this. Fun performances all around, and a really terrific orchestral soundtrack brings back memories of the Hammer horror films of the 60s. Christoph Gans' Silent Hill might be one of the best adaptations of a video game to film ever done. Not for its story, which is generic and slow, or its performances, which are serviceable at best, but for accurately distilling the vibe of the game into film terms. Silent Hill is a ghost town that drifts between purgatory and hell, and the film gets the town's look and feel spot-on perfect, and has more uniquely iconic and disturbingly beautiful horror imagery than most A-list horror films I can think of. And the use of the game's original music by Akira Yamaoka is a brilliant touch. If you ever played the games, the music was half the experience, and is equally evocative as the visuals. James Mangold's Identity may not technically be a horror film, but its eerie 10 Little Indians story set against the backdrop of a seedy desert motel during a nighttime rainstorm evokes a claustrophobic film noir edginess that makes it seem much bigger and scarier than the humble thriller it actually is. The casting is pitch perfect, and this is easily one of my favorite performances by John Cusack. While the reveal of the film's main plot twist may make some feel that the film is a one-trick pony, I disagree. I often return to this film for the great performances, sets, and photography. It's a terrific example of what you can do with great actors and a small budget. Frank Darabont's The Mist is a film where the psychological elements often outweigh the actual horror elements, and is heavily character-driven. Essentially, the Lord of the Flies inside a supermarket, as an unknown event floods a small town with a dense mist that contains deadly creatures. The film has a great 70s retro ambiance, particularly in its finale, which harkens back to the bleaker horror films of that era. Strong performances carry the film, with the exception perhaps of Marcia Gay Harden, who plays the mad church lady a little too over the top to be believed. But since she's the main threat driving the narrative along, I can see why they played her as menacing as possible. I recommend seeing this film in black and white. It's what the director intended, and it's far more effective that way. Adrian Lyne's Jacob's Ladder sort of falls into that vein of films like The Sixth Sense, in that it has a strong supernatural undercurrent, but also an emotional gut punch of an ending that highlights the idea of finding closure by seeing tragedy in a different way. It features great performances by Tim Robbins and the late Elizabeth Pena, and some truly disturbing practical effects that really sell the hallucinatory and paranoid backdrop of demonic forces encroaching into the real world. Nightmarish and excellent. Produced by Guillermo del Toro, J.A. Bayona's The Orphanage is a supernatural thriller that also falls into the category mentioned earlier, but much more a hardcore supernatural tearjerker on par with del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. Those familiar with that film will understand its fairy tale roots, where themes of cruelty against children permeate the story down to its core, and give the film a hardness that's not for everyone. But for those willing to have their emotional buttons pushed to the limit, this is a powerful ghost story and a beautiful, unsettling film. While everything possible has probably been done with zombies, Gary Sherman's Dead and Buried from 1981, with its screenplay overseen by Alien co-authors Dan O'Bannon and Donald Shusett, manages to do something rare, a uniquely eccentric and wholly original take on the undead genre that hasn't been done since. A story about tourists who are horribly murdered, only to reappear alive in the small town of Potter's Bluff, as if they'd always been there. Dead and Buried is a murder mystery with some of the most grisly horror makeup I've ever seen in a film, done by the legendary Dick Smith. Like Alien, this film definitely has a unique edge to its shocking violence that sticks with you after you see it, and like O'Bannon's other work, also has a similarly contrasting black comic tone that elevates it far and above more heavy horror films. If you love horror and haven't seen Dead and Buried, go see it. It will definitely get under your skin. Well, that's all for now. Happy Halloween, and don't forget to leave some comments below and tell me about some of your favorite underrated horror films, and I'll see you next time.